is that once we're giving medications, the patient is no longer a law enforcement patient.
It explained, you could sit a person in a vat of this and you're just not going to get that transdermal lube.
Engine 23 and Medic 23, Larpenteur Avenue West and Fry Street. Police on scene. Shooting. Stand by for police. Box 546. On fire off score. Time 21:07.
Hey everyone, welcome to EMS Connect On Shift, your go-to podcast for everything EMS. Sometimes we're going to educate, sometimes we're going to review EMS articles or books, sometimes we just hang out with badass people and BS, but I'll tell you what, every time we're going to have an absolute blast. I am your host, Sean Pitts. I'm the head of education for EMS Connect. We are a top-tier EMS education organization that offers more education than you'll ever need. We have a website with hundreds of hours of education. We got online EMS refresher courses, and we even offer on-site courses. Before we jump into this episode, please take a moment to go to whatever app you're listening to this on right now and subscribe to our show, give feedback, and give our show a rating. Every rating you give truly elevates this podcast and makes it easier for others to find us. Please help us spread the word about EMS Connect and the On Shift podcast so everyone can get educated. The first one I'd like to welcome to our podcast is Officer Thomas. It is nice to have you on the podcast. He is you are our first non-medical based presenter. So welcome. Go ahead and give a little background on yourself.
Well, thank you for having me. So I am with the Spokane Police Department. I am assigned to the traffic unit. I'm a motor officer. I'm a drug recognition expert. And really what that means is we're not like a narcotic officer, but we do work with them. And being a drug recognition expert, it deals with signs and symptoms, anatomy, physiology, things like that. So we're dealing a lot with when somebody's affected by drugs, we respond to serious injury collisions, fatals, and we either gain PC through that investigation, or we say that we can definitively say that this person is not impaired by anything at this time. So that's part of one of my assignments, being in the traffic unit as a DRE, is responding to fatalities and serious injury collisions. I also am part of our DUI therapeutic court. It's an accountability court where we deal with the most high need offenders that reoffend. And so we want to make sure that we address them because obviously just arresting them time and time again does not fix the problem, and we understand that. So I am now currently assigned as a impaired driving training coordinator for our department, and that allows me to do this. It's on a federal grant and a state grant with Washington State Traffic Safety. So that allows me to actually come out and do educating and teaching with our medical providers at our hospitals, at our medical clinics, things like that, because we see the usefulness in getting that information out. Obviously, our medical personnel, they understand what they're seeing when somebody comes in, their vital signs, overdose, things like that, but they're not always so sure of the common drugs that are happening right now, the current drug trends. And I'm hoping to bridge that gap with saying that these are the things that we see and hopefully give them a little bit of idea what to recognize, especially since most of this stuff does not come back in the toxicological examination. So in your UAs or your blood, we're not seeing that at your local hospital level. Obviously, we can see it when we send it to our state tox lab, but that sometimes is years down the road.
Perfect. Well, welcome. And again, I appreciate your time. We also have joining us for our second half and any sort of input he might have is Dr. Stanton. Dr. Stanton, you want to give your little 5-second introduction here before we get started?
Hey, yeah, I'm Ryan. Still the same one you've seen before when here. So glad to be back and look forward to this topic. Thanks. I think that was 5 seconds.
That was close. Nice job. All right. So today's topic is street smarts, mastering toxidromes in the world of street drugs. So we're going to turn this over to Officer Thomas.
The following PowerPoints are his, which is why you're going to see kind of a small formatting change and not the EMS Connect logo. So we're going to turn this over. Again, please provide any questions and either in the question box or on the onlinequestions.org, and I will ask those and get those answered. But I turn this over to you, sir.
Well, thank you. If you don't know where Spokane is, if you're not from our area, that's a photograph of our wonderful, beautiful city, taken from 1,000 feet or whatever. But if you get down a little closer, unfortunately, it doesn't look as nice and clean.
I imagine there's some Photoshop involved with that one, maybe.
All right, so what we're seeing on the streets right now, obviously medications being prescribed and abused, our street drugs, and then our legal drugs being abused. So legal medications that are out there that we're seeing currently, ketamine. Unfortunately, and when I bring this up, ketamine is actually one that most of you are using currently right now in your ambulances. That's actually posed a little bit of a challenge for us, especially when we go to these collision scenes where somebody is, maybe not seriously injured, maybe they've, hit their knee on the dashboard, and they're asking for pain medication, and so we get our local AMR or paramedics administer ketamine. That does affect how we go about doing our investigations. So that's posed a little bit of a challenge. And then we have obviously our opioid medication, the benzodiazepines, and the amphetamine salts. So bring this topic up because a lot of people don't even understand what they're putting in their body. Is it legal? When they're talking about CBD oil, or our cannabis, are these things legal? And in our states, we'll talk about all the states in the United States where it is legal. Is it legal for medicinal? Is it legal for personal consumption? And then we have things like spice and kratom. Are those legal? So right now in the United States, we have 12 states where it is completely unlawful to possess or consume cannabis. We have 15 that allow medicinal marijuana. And then we have the other states, several of the ones that actually have legal for medical use also can have, it can vary whether they're in their local jurisdictions, whether they can allow it to be sold or not, or decriminalized. So here's a daily cannabis for being used and abused actually took place. It was alcohol until recently. So in 2022, 17 million people reported using cannabis daily. And I say cannabis, excuse me if you're not from Washington State, but they actually mandate us use the word cannabis and not marijuana or weed or whatever. We are required to call it cannabis. Apparently the others are discriminatory. So we are saying cannabis, even though the slide will show cannabis, marijuana, whatever it is. However, so in 2022, 17.7 million people reported using cannabis. And that is compared to 14.7 million daily users of alcohol, just drinking. So what's interesting about that is if you go back to the other slide, if you look how many states it is still unlawful to possess or consume, and then you factor in all of those states have alcohol in them, and we're actually seeing a very high consumption of cannabis. And so in those states where it's legal or it's legal just for medical, you can imagine that there is an extremely high amount of abuse going on with those. So high concentrates of cannabis. So this is a 2024 data, and it shows that it is the most commonly used drug in the world. And what's very disturbing about this is that we also know that the data is actually very clear that the high concentrations have gone up. In Washington State, when they legalized it, they didn't put a cap on how much THC can be, what the THC concentrates can be at. So Washington State just said, if you're going to make high concentrations, well, they've done that because they've actually they're finding that, they have 99% THC in some of these concentrates. So the problem with that is these high concentrates of THC are not acting like your 70s, 80s cannabis. It's actually causing all kinds of things like, somebody actually passing out after they've consumed. They're also finding that there's a lot of links between high concentration ingestion with our adolescence, since the brain is not actually even fully developed until the age of 25, that those kids are likely, they're, I believe, 5 times more likely to struggle with a psychotic episode, a psychotic break. And so Washington State, we actually tried to, there was a bill that was to try to reduce the amount of, actually bring the age up to 25 years of age for anybody buying cannabis with 25% THC. But the data actually even shows they should not even be consuming. And they thought they had all of the votes for that actually to go through. However, when it came down to the voting, obviously saying how much money is being, the revenue that is being made from cannabis sales, and they decided to not vote it through. They did, however, say that they were going to require that the cannabis shops put a sign in there saying that this could cause early psychosis to individuals under 25, and that they should not consume it. So here is a recent published data that shows that this is the high concentration of cannabis is actually changing the marker on the DNA, and that's where they're believing the link is for this early onset of psychosis. So another drug that we're seeing is the synthetic cannabinoids. And just so we're clear, synthetic cannabinoid has nothing to do with cannabis. The only thing it has to do with is that it actually works with the CBD or the CB2 receptors in the brain. It is not linked to cannabis. It is not from the plant. There's nothing at all there's nothing at all that this is dealing with other than it's affecting the CB1 and CB2 receptors. This is a synthetic chemical that is created in a lab. Most of the time it's in China. And what they do is they send it over in, vats, jugs, whatever. And then the end user ends up putting it on a leafy material like oregano or some kind of leafy material that can be burned. And they spray it in a like a bathtub or a large vat, and then they let it dry, and then they package it for sale. So when the person is ingesting it, they're ingesting whatever the leafy material is along with this chemical agent, which is the synthetic cannabinoid. This is being heavily abused with our people who are on probation, parole, because it's very difficult for them to actually get a test result to come back as positive. And there's several reasons for that. One of the reasons is they change the compound every time the DEA finds this compound. They're changing the molecular structure to where it cannot be identified in testing any further. So if you go to the DEA website and you look up synthetic cannabinoids, there's over 100, I think 125 known compounds, but that increases every year. DMT is another one that is it's being sold at our local smoke shops. So our dispensaries cannot sell anything other than a cannabis product. So they can't sell the synthetic cannabinoids. They cannot sell DMT. But what they end up doing is a lot of these stores are purchasing a store very close by. Some of them are splitting the stores in half, having half of it be a dispensary and half of it actually selling other items like this, the synthetic cannabinoids, the DMT, and other things that we'll talk about here. And the reason why they're doing that is because a lot of people like these other effects, but they like to combine it with their cannabis. On the DMT, it's a naturally occurring psychedelic drug in the tryptamine family. There is a toad that actually excretes this it secretes it out of glands, and that is found in the Colorado River in South America. And they'll let that excretion dry, and then they'll smoke it. And our kids are actually being able to purchase this over websites as well. And you see that they're in on the photograph there. That is actually a cartridge that is able to be loaded into a vape device. And so they're smoking it while they're driving down the road. They're smoking it at their schools, and obviously it's causing issues.
Hey, Mike, question popped in.
Yes.
What information do you have about other cannabinoids like Delta 8 or Delta 9, including the availability of these substances online? Are these substances that have any specific signs or symptoms that EMS providers should be aware of?
Yes, and we'll get right to those.
Perfect.
Right where I'm headed.
I figured.
Okay. Kratom. Kratom is another drug that we're seeing. I think I blacked it out. Okay. Kratom is another drug that we're seeing. So this is heavily used in our area. And so the mitragynine is the actual active chemical in kratom that they're actually looking for. And you can go to any of these smoke shops around town, and they're just everywhere. These smoke shops, a lot of the gas stations are selling these, and you'll see a lot of these kind of products. If anything says 7-ON or ON7, that's referring to the 7-hydroxymitragynine, and that is actually what they're looking to get. And now you might ask, why would you want to use this? Why would somebody want to abuse this? Well, they're using it when they can't get opioids. So this is one of the ones that originally our FDA and DEA made this unlawful, but then there was a lot of pushback saying, hey, this might potentially be something that people could use to get off of opioids like fentanyl. And so using this for the purposes of potential treatment for abuse. And then it was legalized. And now several states have said, hey, we're actually seeing overdoses on this. We're seeing, we've had some fatalities from this. People using this when they can't find their fentanyl or other opioids, they're using this and they're overdosing and dying. And so it's not an opioid. However, it does work on the opioid receptors. And so this is an issue where if somebody can't find it, they'll go down to their local smoke shop, or they might even go to the websites like Amazon, several platforms that they might be able to purchase this, and they'll buy it in large amounts. I've done several evaluations, even one yesterday, where the guy said that, yeah, I was using it when I couldn't find fentanyl. Another lady was using only this because she didn't like how dirty fentanyl was, or she knew this was pure. And so she's like, hey, they need to make this stuff unlawful. I'm hooked on this. I'm addicted. I can't get off. And, she was absolutely looked no different than somebody that was on an opioid, being on the nod, not able to respond, pupils constricted. She just was not able to even function. And it was all this. It had nothing to do with any other opioid.
Well, you were the first person to bring this up to me, and I was at the gas station not far from my house the other day and just happened to see it on the shelf, purchasable in the gas station. And I pointed at it and pointed it out to my family and said, we're going to be talking about this. And I was totally blown away.
Yeah. And it's in all forms and fashions. There's pills, there's powders. As a matter of fact, I think we were discussing the other day that even our coffee shops, so coffee shops right near the school, and we're really close to one of the local high schools here. And there's within walking distance, within a block of the high school, there's two different smoke shops. You go in there. I went into one of them and just watched in a matter of 10 minutes, 7-8 people purchase kratom. So the coffee shops are allowing, kids to purchase an espresso or whatever, and they get a shot of coffee, and then they can also add a shot of kratom as well. So Washington State tried to pass, and several states have, like I said, have passed laws outlawing kratom. Washington State actually tried to pass a law to restrict the sales of kratom to people under 18, but that died on the House floor. And so it can be sold to anyone right now. Some of these head shops will actually, or these smoke shops, these gas stations will say we don't sell it to anybody under 18 or 21, but that is not actually the fact. I mean, the coffee shops sell it, like I said, to anybody and everybody that'll come in and buy a coffee. So that's concerning. So if you have somebody that will absolutely say, I do not use any opiates, it might be something like kratom. So they're mixing kratom with a lot of other things as well. They're mixing kratom and kava. They're mixing kratom and cannabis. They're sold. The photograph that is on this slide right here, that was actually the gas station that is a block away from us right now at the high school. I walked in there, snapped that photo, and like you can see, there's 20, 30 different products, and that was one of 4 or 5 different cabinet shelves where they had these specific substances for sale to anybody and everybody. So here's kratom and THC, and when we were talking about the other things that we were talking about, Delta 9, Delta 8, HHC, there's things like Delta 8A, HHCA, and so I'll touch on those for a second, and CBD. But you notice in this, they do have the Mitragina Spicosia extract in each bottle, 100 milligrams. So they're mixing this with just about everything. A lot of weightlifters as well. People going to the gym, they use kratom as a recovery tool. So they mix it in their with their power, like protein shakes and whatnot. They believe it has some kind of medicinal value or helping for them to recover from the gym as well. Mushrooms, Amanita muscaria. That is something that is not only being sold at these local smoke shops as well, but is actually being sold on just about every platform. Facebook, Twitter, I think it's Twitter, X. For sure, it is being sold on Facebook and Instagram. These will pop up on advertisements saying, hey, these are legal, and that's absolutely true. These are completely legal in the United States. There are several states that have tried to ban them, several that are attempting to ban them, Washington State being one of them. They're attempting to ban them. But the big pushback is they're not psychedelic, and that is completely inaccurate. So in smaller doses, they don't seem to be as psychedelic. However, when somebody wants them to be psychedelic, all they got to do is use just a little bit more. So here's some of the products that these are sold in. And at that same gas station, there's probably 15, 20 different packages like this. They're sold in candy bars and gummies, drinks. Even some of the coffee shops are even selling these as well. Just like, hey, they'll help you relax or they'll help you focus, things like that. And I'm not sure if you're aware of the American Airlines pilot that went to a Gorge concert at Washington State Gorge, where the day afterwards he got on a flight to go from Seattle to Portland, and during the middle of the flight he wasn't a passenger, he was just sitting in one of the jump seats in the cockpit, and in the middle of the flight he reached up and tried to grab the extinguishers for the engines of the airplane, tried to douse both engines out, which would have made them completely lose control and not be able to continue the flight. And they were able to essentially struggle with him, get him away from him without actually extinguishing the engines. They fought with him with the flight attendants in the hallway right behind the cockpit. And he finally said, okay, I'm good. And then he jumped up, went for the exit door and tried to grab the exit door and open the exit door. His intent was to jump out of the plane. He was very candid in some interviews about this. And he said, yes, I used these mushrooms at a concert. And I thought that the flight wasn't real. And I felt if I got out of the airplane that I would kind of wake up from this hallucination, this false reality. And so that's why I'm trying to bring a lot of attention to this, because these are the things that, everybody believes are okay to be using. So we have kids using these. We have your everyday person using this, believing it relaxes you. And there was a doctor actually in this case where this pilot had talked about it, and the doctor actually reported that he's with the UCLA Medical Center. He said this is absolutely what he has seen as well, is that even 48 hours to 72 hours after ingesting these mushrooms, that they could have these still hallucinations happening. So this is what the actual mushroom looks like. Most people will not eat the mushroom. They don't just go, and this grows pretty much everywhere. And so you might find these out in the forest or whatever, but if somebody actually goes and tries to eat them, they're not usually going to get the wanted effects of it. It usually has to be refined a little bit. Tianeptine. Tianeptine is, this is what a lot of these gas stations, a lot of the smoke shops are selling as gas station heroin. It has a lot of names like Zaza, Neptune, Tia. But this is something that people are using as well when they can't get their hands on the fentanyl or other medications. I wanted to circle back real quick to the marijuana, the cannabis, the Delta 9, Delta 8, because I don't know that I actually had it in this presentation. I kind of thought that I thought it was in there, but it's actually another presentation that I have. And to answer that question, so the Delta 8 and Delta 10 are different cannabinoids within the cannabis plant. Delta 8 and Delta 10 are a little less potent than Delta 9. So why would people want to use those? And in Delta 8, they're wanting to use those because for a few reasons. One, if they're on probation parole, it's harder for them to test. Some of their tests will not come back with Delta 8 or Delta 10. A lot of people believe, and there's a lot of myths out there, that Delta 8 and Delta 10 does not cause any highs. It doesn't get them impaired. It doesn't make them feel euphoric like Delta 9 does. However, that's not true. It's just a little less. So they just consume more and they're getting about the same high. It's just with a different one of the cannabinoids in the plant. Same with the HHC. The HHCA and the Delta 8A, those are different because those are completely inert until heated. So if you ate them like an edible, you're not going to have any highs from them. You're not going to get any benefits. You're not going to get anything from them whatsoever. So people don't. However, Delta 8, Delta 10, and the HHC, HHCA, Delta 8A, Delta 8A, those are actually able to be sold at the smoke shops, not in dispensaries. So your kids can go over and purchase Delta 8, Delta 10 in most locations, the HHC, HHCA. And most people will say, hey, these, there's nothing that makes them unlawful because they're not cannabis. They don't cause that impairment. Well, they do actually bind with the same receptors and cause impairment and cause the euphoric feelings just like Delta 9 once they're heated. So if you heat them by smoking them, then you get that exact same type of euphoric feeling, that same high. So I'm sure everybody is familiar with Matt Perry and how he died, the actor off of Friends. If you're not, he died of ketamine overdose. So they actually ended up charging 2 doctors for this death. He had sought treatment for depression and anxiety. He went to a local clinic where he became addicted to intravenous ketamine. And according to the DEA, when the doctors refused to increase his dose, he started going on the black market and purchasing it. And I believe the investigation led them to him purchasing it through the mail, and they ended up doing an investigation. That's how they found these 2 doctors. But that is, a lot of people don't know that that's what he died from, was ketamine. They thought he'd overdosed. He was readily very vocal about his addictions and the struggles that he was having with alcohol, other depressant medications, even painkillers. But ketamine was what it ended up taking his life. So ketamine, there's been a lot of recent research on ketamine that it is helping with PTSD and some other things. And there's a lot of good studies on it. I think you even had a podcast on this.
We did.
And I'm very familiar with one of the nurses that was on here. And there's a lot of good, interesting research being done on ketamine in microdoses. But the problem is when people are abusing drugs, they don't use microdosing, right? They just, if a little's good, then maybe a lot's better, right? And so that's where we end up finding people using and abusing this stuff. So it can be injected, smoked, insufflated. It's a short acting drug, and that's why, it's good for EMS. That's, and it helps with it can be helpful in a lot of things because it's not only a pain reducer or it helps with pain management, but it also, it's a dissociative drug. So those people who, like, if somebody is suffering from an excited delirium situation and they're given ketamine, now they're not worried about all those external stimulants, like, the police standing around or the things that are coming after them. If it was something that was triggering that, this actually is very helpful for that. But again, it is being bought on the black market and abused. Liam Payne. So he's a One Direction singer. If you're not familiar with who he is, he had a suspicious death not too long ago in October in Buenos Aires, Argentina. So the autopsy found he had pink cocaine, benzodiazepine, in his system the night he fell from, I believe it was a third-story balcony. And he also had some paraphernalia in his hotel room. So this is what pink cocaine is. So pink cocaine is 2CB. Even though it has the name of cocaine, there is usually never any cocaine found in this product. It's a synthetic stimulant, and it has psychedelic properties. So this is found in a lot of the club scenes. It's another club drug, not unlike Molly or MDMA, ecstasy. It is very similar, but it does a couple other things. It has euphoric effects, and it gives people a lot of increased energy, and that a lot of people really like it in the club scenes, not unlike the ecstasy. And so this is a new kind of a new fad that's happening. We haven't seen a lot here, but we hear it's coming up and down the West Coast. So in California, it's very popular in California, in Oregon, and even in the Seattle area. And I'm sure it's being found all over the United States. All right, so now we get into what I'm sure everybody's very familiar with, fentanyl. So we have fentanyl, we have our M30s. So there's some common names of those are blues, mexis. And on the other side, you see the powder. That is the powdered fentanyl. Street name for that we're talking about it when you hear it now is usually Fetty. So it's approximately 100 times more potent than the morphine and 50 times more potent than heroin. It's synthetically created in a laboratory. It's easy to manufacture, transport, conceal. It's inexpensive to create. Although China has been getting some pressure, not only from the United States and other countries, but they've also been slowing down their production. I don't know if it's to try to ask for more money from the cartel. So we've actually discovered that the Mexican cartel are creating this from nothing in laboratories in Mexico. And how they're doing that is they're coming over the border and they're actually looking for chemists in our universities and paying them a lot of money, up to $50,000 a month, to come down there and create this in their labs. So a lethal dose, less than a few grains of salt, about 2 milligrams. It produces effects such as relaxation, euphoria, pain relief, sedation, confusion, drowsiness, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, urinary retention, pupillary constriction, and respiratory depression. I'm sure most of you already know that. But what's in it? Well, here's what a lot of people don't know. So there's fentanyl in it. And then you have the binders, which could be anything and everything. You also have methamphetamine in it, xylazine, nitazene, and a lot of other things. Here's how it's manufactured. So the labs are not clean. They're not sterile by any means. They mix it up in vats. And so these chemists that are asked, or these people that are just mixing the actual fentanyl chemical in with these binders, they're not doing it in any real methodical way. They're doing this in houses that they go in. They're doing it on the stove. They're not using respirators. They're using a piece of cloth over their face or a dust mask, and that's how they're using it. There's many reports, and this is even from newspapers in Mexico, that are talking with people that have been involved in these, and they're saying that these people are often overdosing and dying, and they just find somebody new to take their place. Some of the chemists that they've brought in from the United States, they have said that they work until they pretty much pass out from an overdose. They drag them out, Narcan them, and they put them right back to work. So how are they checking to see if they've got a good product at the end? What's their quality control? Well, unfortunately, in the United States, because these labs are actually taking place in the United States, not just Mexico, because it's easier to transport liquid fentanyl from Mexico into the United States and then create the pills up here. So they find a vacant farmhouse, a barn, a couple of trailer houses in the middle of nowhere, and they start producing. Well, how do they know that they've got a good product? Well, they'll go to local farm, I guess you would say, people that sell chickens and rabbits, some of your farm stores or your local farmers that sell these, and they will actually just inject the rabbit or the chicken. And if the chicken or rabbit die within a minute, they know they've got a strong enough product. If it doesn't die, then they add some things like nitazene or adds a little bit more fentanyl into it, or xylazine. On the Mexican side of the border, they're actually going and just giving it to a lot of the transient population that are along the Mexican border, and they're seeing if they overdose. Unfortunately, they're using human guinea pigs there.
So before you move on to that one, what are you seeing with regard to the changes in substance abuse patterns with like the tightening of opioid legislation and prescribing?
Repeat that question.
Yeah, absolutely. What are you seeing with regard to the changes in substance abuse patterns with the tightening of opioid legislation and prescribing?
Well, so years ago, when heroin was very common, people were using heroin, and when we'll go back even to our war in Afghanistan, right? The poppy fields got taken out. That was a strategic event where we actually tried to take the money out of the Afghanis and the Taliban. So we took out a lot of the poppy seed fields, which took a lot of the money out of the Taliban. And so that pretty much had the cartel in a bit of a pinch with trying to figure out how to supply all the demand in the United States for the other opioids, the heroin. At that time when we saw that, we also saw a huge increase in people going and doing pharmacy robberies, where they were jumping the counters, they were holding pharmacies up, and they were stealing things like the Oxycontins, oxycodones, hydrocodones, all of those things. Well, since fentanyl has hit the street, we pretty much don't have any of those anymore. And we've really been way behind the eight ball on this, because we didn't have a whole lot of ability to identify fentanyl at the very beginning. We now have drug dogs that are working the borders and in the United States and able to hit on fentanyl. But again, the cartel is actually doing things as they see we're doing things. They're countering it with other things like the nitazene. The nitazene is something that we don't have a whole lot of testing capability for. We even have some sensors and some ability to see fentanyl with a few of our, we'll just say they're like a gadget that is able to identify that it is fentanyl and not like cocaine or methamphetamine. But we don't have that with the nitazene. And I think that's where the move might be coming, is they're trying to get ahead of this, when we start stopping the influx of the fentanyl into the United States, they're just going to bring something else in that we don't even know is coming, like the nitazene. And if you aren't familiar with what nitazene is, it's actually 50 times more potent than fentanyl. It's another opioid. Hopefully that answered the question. So in the xylazine,
Both of those came from the doc. So yeah, he'll let us know if he didn't answer it.
I guess we'll hear. On the xylazine. So this is xylazine. It's difficult because we don't use it in the United States. So it is used in veterinary medicine as an animal sedation anesthetic. It's with muscle relaxants and analgesic properties, but we don't use it for human or on humans for any reason in the United States. It's a central nervous system depressant. It can cause respiratory depression, slowed heart rate, and hypotension. When used with fentanyl, it may produce or potentiate the sedation, respiratory depression, amnesia, increasing the risk for fatal overdoses. So repeated xylazine use also is associated with skin ulcerations, necrosis of the skin. So this slide right here is kind of why I started doing this, why I started presenting at hospitals, ERs, medical facilities, to providers, etc. And this is really kind of where this conversation built, is because a lot of our medical community didn't understand what xylazine was. And we would get patients, they'd be bringing patients in an overdose state into the ERs, and our medical providers would be doing everything they could, thinking this was just an opiate and treating this as such until they realized it was not reacting with the Narcan naloxone. And so they would stop treating the fentanyl or the opioid overdose, and they would start trying to treat other things. And when I did a first class on what xylazine is and how it works with fentanyl, the next day, one of the nurses went in and had explained to the doctor that they were working on an overdose patient, and they had been working on it for some time, and they believed it wasn't an overdose on fentanyl. And she explained this to the doctor. The doctor ended up giving Narcan again about 15 minutes into CPR, and they started to get a reaction. And so the reason for that is that xylazine has a shorter half-life, so shorter duration of effects on the body than the fentanyl. And so when they ingest the fentanyl and xylazine together, the xylazine will wear off first. And so you may still have those overdose happening, but as the xylazine breaks down and wears out, now you just are dealing with straight narcotic, the fentanyl overdose. And so I try to make sure that people understand that you still have to give the naloxone Narcan in a situation like that. You can't just stop, because eventually it will start working. Obviously, I'll let the doctor talk a little bit more about that. But so why xylazine? Well, in combination with opioids like fentanyl, it makes the euphoric effects last longer. And the common street drug name for that is tranq. And we're hearing that all over. I just had some of my colleagues were down in Pennsylvania this last week, and they're calling it tranq. But don't believe that anything that when somebody calls something tranq that it's just xylazine, fentanyl, methamphetamine. They're finding all kinds of things in tranq. Half of these people who are using this stuff have no idea what they're ingesting. And half of the people, just like we talked about, that are making this stuff, they're just adding a little bit of this or that or the other thing if it's not potent enough. So here's what tranq looks like. So it is an alpha-2 adrenal receptor agonist. It does cause necrosis of the skin. So directly related to its vasoconstriction. And I keep trying to tell people when they're dealing with somebody that's been using this, we commonly were seeing people who are using heroin or methamphetamine. You would see track marks. If they were muscling the injections, they were using it, muscling, you would get that common abscess where the dirty needle goes in, you get that infection, etc. Tranq is not that. These small little spots, I'll show you some pictures here in a minute, but these small spots that are causing, that are showing up on the skin can be anywhere. It has nothing to do with the ingestion of the drug. It can be on their face, it can be on their head, their neck, it can be on their feet, their hands, their arms, their legs, their abdomen. It can be anywhere. So if you see those, and some of those, I mean, some people may think they're just, well, these are like bug bites, or these are mite bites, or maybe chicken pox or something to that effect. It may be the tranq. So if it's untreated, it can also cause a super infection as well. This is what some of those look like. And you can see, like on the hands, you seem very small. Those are the very beginnings of them. And then you see the super infections. All right, so again, just like I'd said before, the naloxone, it may not be effective right away on an opioid, it may not be effective on somebody who is using fentanyl that is mixed with the xylazine, just because the xylazine does not work on the opioid receptors. It doesn't do anything as far as that's concerned. So nitazine, we talked about that a little bit ago. It is a Schedule I drug. It is more potent than fentanyl. Street name is isotony Frankenstein opioid, 1,000 times more potent than morphine. Been around since the 1950s, but most of the providers and the people that were trying to use it in the medical world all agreed it was just too unsafe to use. It is a lot longer half-life, 3.1 times longer than fentanyl, and that's concerning, right? So when you're dealing with somebody with an overdose, where you're thinking, okay, we're getting to the point where we should be able to let up on the amount of naloxone, Narcan we're using. Well, if it is the nitazine, the nitazine is a lot longer, so you're going to have to be dealing with that a lot longer. So we're also seeing Xanax that is counterfeit. In the counterfeit Xanax, you're having your benzodiazepines. You're also having methamphetamine and fentanyl. So they're adding all of this stuff into those. And, we'll talk about why they're doing that. And everybody's like, why would they just, if you're wanting a Xanax, if you're wanting an anti-anxiety medication, why would you put methamphetamine and fentanyl in it? Well, we'll go into that a little. This is a little container that has Mexi's Blues, which is fentanyl, methamphetamine, right? And then it also has Bus Bar. They had some pieces of Bus Bar that were counterfeit in there that did have the fentanyl and the methamphetamine. And that was probably 6 months ago. That's my hand holding the pills there. It was the first that I had seen anything that was even that looks like a Xanax, but was not actually counterfeit Xanax. It was counterfeit Bus Bar. So possible overdose signs with opiates, obviously cardiac arrest, respiratory arrest, stupor, pupil constrictions, cold and clammy skin, cyanosis, coma, and death. When I used to teach this, because I used to teach this to medical professionals and medical providers and first responders, look for those constricted pupils, right? Look for those constricted pupils on opiates. Now I don't want to encourage that. I don't want to encourage that as being your number one, because what people end up doing is they'll look at the pupils and they're like, this person's pupils are what we would consider normal, within the average range and an expected range. So if it's not constricted, then we're not dealing with opiates. Well, that's not the case. Because when they add methamphetamine, you get the tachycardia, cardiac arrhythmia, paranoia, hallucinogens, excited delirium, hypertension, strokes, hypothermia, sweating, chest pains, possible pupil dilation. So again, when we're talking about you putting these two drugs together, now you don't know what you're going to have. Pupil size may be dilated, they may be constricted, they may be within the expected range. Same with pulse rate, blood pressure, body temperature. Most of the people that I evaluated, one of them today, right before I came here, most of his vital signs were within the expected range. His systolic blood pressure was a little high. Pupil size was right in the expected range. Wasn't constricted, wasn't dilated in 3 different lighting conditions. So I caution people about really hanging your hat on one thing, like, oh, it's not pupillary constriction, so it's not an opioid. That's not the case. So fentanyl mixed with xylazine overdose. Xylazine has that longer duration of effects than fentanyl. Naloxone may need to be administered repeatedly, even if not responding to it initially. So why is this such a problem? Well, it is supply and demand. The opioid epidemic is, we have so much of it out there that it originally came out, it was $20 a pill. We've seen it as low as 50 cents a pill. So if you buy in bulk, you can get it for much cheaper. Right now, it's about 2 to 7 per pill. And an 8-ball is about 350, so 3 to 3.5 grams. And then 12 to 1,500 per ounce. Xanax pills are staying around that 15 to 20 because they're just not as popular. So you just don't have that supply and demand there. They're just more at a lot of the club drugs or with a lot of our younger teenagers and early 20s. Powdered fentanyl. A lot of people are wanting to try to stay with fentanyl, the powdered fentanyl recently. And that is because they feel like it's cleaner for some reason. But it's actually the same thing. When we talk about why would they actually mix the fentanyl with the methamphetamine? Well, from a business standpoint, as a dealer, as the cartel creating a drug, you don't want to kill off your customer. That's bad business practice, right? So what you do is when you have a lot of people overdosing, you counteract that. So if you're going to stop their heart, you're going to put them into cardiac arrest, pulse rate goes down, blood pressure, respirations, everything's down with the fentanyl, you put a stimulant in there. You stimulate it to keep them alive. So this is where I bring up on that what people need to remember is that when people ingest fentanyl, they most of the time have no idea they're ingesting the other drugs. They have no idea they're ingesting methamphetamine. They have no idea they're ingesting xylazine. They believe they're just bringing in an opioid, and that will make them feel good, euphoric. And so now you have somebody who is using these other drugs and they had no idea. So when they get a test result back from probation or the hospital and says, you've been using methamphetamine, they'll be adamant in denying it because they had no idea. And that's often very true, that they didn't have they had no want of the methamphetamine. They wanted to steer clear of it, but now they're actually using it. And that comes into the therapeutic side of it. When you have somebody that has maybe been struggling with heroin and now fentanyl, and they're like, I've never used a stimulant. Now they're struggling with a stimulant addiction as well. So here's some common drug paraphernalia that you might see when dealing with somebody that is using. So on the upper left, you'll see that there is aluminum foil, and there is the pills that are on the aluminum foil. When somebody uses a fentanyl pill, like a Mexi Blue, they don't eat that. They don't take it orally. They smoke it. So they smoke until they get the euphoric effects that they want. Usually it's at the very beginning, maybe just a little bit of a couple puffs of this fentanyl as it's being burned. You get this smoke, and they'll use the straw in their mouth and they breathe in all of that smoke until they get that desired effects. Most people will not smoke more than a quarter of a pill to a half a pill at any time during the ingestion. So if you were to actually take one of these pills and eat it orally, that would be a fatal dose. So most of these pills will last 3, 4, 5, 6 different ingestions on this one person. But people will use these every couple hours. They'll wake up and they'll want more, so they use more. We've had somebody that was using over 100 pills a day. So that's a pretty substantial amount. But on opioids, you're building that tolerance. So your body becomes tolerant of it and you just want more. So talking more back to the fentanyl and methamphetamine use, So when you see the effects of the fentanyl being gone in about 4 hours, the methamphetamine staying around 12 hours. So every time they ingest, they're increasing that amount of methamphetamine in their system, even though the fentanyl has worn off. So that's why some of these people who, if you're looking at them and you're thinking, this person is really, really struggling with a stimulant issue, they may be using fentanyl, but that stimulant is just building up and compounding in their system. Here are some drug smoking devices. We've seen needles go away quite a bit since heroin has gone off and fentanyl has come on the streets with the powder and the pills, and it's because they're smoking it. They're no longer really ingesting it through hypodermic needles. They don't, you're seeing people's track marks slowly go away. They're not, you're not getting near the abscesses anymore. People are smoking it. So aluminum foil, you'll see it anywhere and everywhere. I've watched people downtown get in fistfights over a little small piece of foil because that's the way they ingest it, right? They need that foil. They'll use pop cans, beer cans, whatever, just enough to heat that pill to get that binder to start smoking. Now the pills or the pipes that they're using, that could be anything. That could be an ink pen that they tear apart. It could be an antenna on your car. They'd break off the antenna and smoke it using that. Here's some more. These are all of mine. I just actually had the other day. I decided to take a photograph. These all came off of one person.
At least they got the Narcan there.
They do. They got the Narcans. Common paraphernalia, right? You got to have the Narcan, and they keep a little of everything. So these are actually those things that are all twisted and bent. Those are the one with the pills. That's a piece of plastic pipe which is an ink pen. When it's heated so much, it bends and all that. And then they're using even the meth pipes to smoke the powder fentanyl or the pill fentanyl. And obviously you can see the lighters, the butane torches, et cetera, because they got to get that very hot. Some things that people don't associate with fentanyl or drug abuse is Imodium. So Imodium, the Suboxone, Miralax, Q-tips, cotton swabs, and then just about at any smoke shop, they always have these power flushes, ultra cleans, things like that. When they're on probation, parole, they want to get their urine clean, so they'll have boxes of these in their purses or bags, etc. So why would you have Imodium AD? Why would you have Miralax? Well, opioids causes constipation, right? So a lot of these people will want to usually end up having a bowel movement. After so long and they don't have it, they force the issue with some Miralax. And with Imodium AD, well, a lot of people are thinking, well, maybe Imodium AD, because when they start getting sick, when they can't get their drug, they get diarrhea, and so they want to help that. Well, that's kind of the case, but what ended up happening is a lot of people have found that Imodium AD, if you take in large amounts, so boxes of this, it actually can give them that a little bit of euphoric and keep them high enough to where they won't get sick. They won't even start to overdose. Or I'm sorry, they won't start to come off of it in withdrawal. So you'll find that they'll actually kind of keep these in their back pocket. So when they can't find their drug, they'll actually use just boxes of these. When we had the problem with the heroin as much, and we don't really see heroin around here much more, but the Q-tips and cotton swabs, they would keep little pouches, whether it's a tin can or a little baggie, and they would just fill them with all these bloody Q-tip ends. And a lot of officers would ask me, what are these about? Why are they keeping these? And it was in case they couldn't find drugs, they would eat them. And that would, again, keep them from withdrawing. Here's how they smoke it. There's the foil, the pipe, and then they use the lighter below it. And they would just burn the pill until it becomes vapor and ingest it. Exposure issues. So here's one that I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about. It's a little bit of a myth, and that is there's a lot of misinformation out there that says that if somebody touches a Mexi Blue, that they're going to automatically have an overdose. Well, there's a lot of data on this, and we have really found that a lot of those, and I don't want to armchair quarterback or say anybody's not experiencing what they experienced, but a lot of our data is showing that this is not usually an overdose situation. It's usually an anxiety attack. And not saying you can't have an exposure, because there are exposures when people are smoking this around you. You can absolutely get an exposure. If it's the powdered fentanyl is easily introduced into the air, and you can absolutely get a large ingestion of the fentanyl that way. And that could definitely become a problem. So we encourage everybody to not open or move any powder that they see. But as far as the Mexi Blues, the blue pills, they're in a binder to where it is not easily transdermally absorbed. Now, if you were to add those blues with alcohol or some other chemical agents that would help with transdermal absorption, like as acetone, that absolutely can help with that. But for the most part, just if you saw a pill and you just happen to brush it aside, and obviously everybody encourages everybody to be using, gloves when they're contacting this anyway, but everybody has made it seem like if you just are in the same room as a Mexi Blue, you're going to get exposed and have an overdose, and that's just not the case. So hopefully and there's plenty of data on that as well. You can do your own research on that. Dr. Bloom, with Director of Chemical and Pharmaceutical Science, has a great has published a good article on this, just talking about how this is just not the case. So, and I think he even summed it up by basically saying, if we don't have everybody dying of an overdose that is dealing these, then you understand it is not that easily transdermally absorbed.
Because the dealers don't use gloves, right? So
they absolutely do not. So that's all I have for you. There is my contact information. At the bottom there's a QR code that gives you my business card. It has my bio on it, the contact information, my email address, etc. That's also my department's email address. If you have any emails you want to send my department about the presentation, please do. Or if you want to contact me directly, that is my email.
Great. Well, I thank you very much for your time. Dr. Stanton wanted to give you kudos for bringing up the rumors about exposures. So he was blowing up my phone, texting me about how happy he was and using stickers and GIFs and the typical communication. So I want to give Dr. Stanton, is there anything you want to kind of add on or piggyback before we go into intermission and then you take over on your specific topic?
No, I love the fact that he mentioned the opioid exposure. I mean, other than aerosolization of a substance, even the transdermal exposure and absorption would just take astronomical amounts. You're not going to get that by touching it, because we use fentanyl potentially as a transdermal, and it takes a ton with an agent to assist it to get it to absorb it at even a therapeutic level. So my biggest concern is that this fear of potential exposure-induced intoxication or overdose is going to prevent somebody from getting life-saving measures. And so you're not going to get an overdose just by being in the proximity of these substances. If you go in and somebody's just aerosolizing, the substance for some reason, then we're talking about a different thing that we may mention in my talk. But that is a huge myth that has been carried on, and we in emergency medicine have been trying to fight that for a while. And the other, talking about the xylazine and the nitazine and those types of things, if you're getting to the point as EMS, if you're BLS, of course, the administration of the intranasal naloxone, which most states, I think across the country now,
I think it's national.
Yeah, I think it's national. Administering that. But for the paramedics in the audience, in the end, it really boils down to airway management. If we secure the airway, we don't need to reverse anything. At that point, it's just almost treating like a methadone, where we have a prolonged recovery period as opposed to heroin, which has kind of spoiled us because it's one and done. So just remember that in the end, you don't have to reverse it. You just need to make sure you maintain and manage the airway. And if you've done that, then we can let it ride at that point. But otherwise, fantastic. And I appreciate Officer Thompson, and great presentation. That's a great choice, Sean, on a first
Right.
EMS medical person on here.
And we're going to have him back. I think we're going to make him our resident drug person.
Resident Popo. Yeah,
we hope so. And I wanted to point out as well, you spoke about the transdermal absorption of the fentanyl, and just so everybody's clear, because it's very it's misinformation out there. However, that being said, if you look in the CDC guidelines as of May 2022, it still is being published, that it says right there that glove transdermal exposure is possible since opioid, particularly fentanyl, can penetrate human skin. And I get why they're putting it in there, but that's not applicable to most of what we see on the street.
Yeah, and they're still recommending Tamiflu too, which is BS. But that's a different conversation, a different session. But I agree. And the key here, I think what your key take home there is that just like any case we deal with, proper PPE is recommended. Just because your bigger risk is going to be exposure to potential Hep C, HIV, things like that. Whereas, the drug overdose in terms of toxicity is not going to happen transdermally. I think I saw somewhere, and this probably wasn't from the CDC, that would basically take you bathing in a bathtub of fentanyl, you to get enough transdermal exposure to actually cause an overdose. So unless you're going to swim in it, you're probably going to be okay. The recommendation there is proper PPE anytime you're going to deal with any patient, but especially in this case, overdose patients.
Yeah, I think I actually read the exact same article you did, and I believe that was by Dr. Bloom, that explained, you could sit a person in a vat of this and you're just not going to get that transdermal absorption.
I just want to come on and say EMS Connect does not endorse bathing in fentanyl or anything, just to make sure that's clear as a bell before we...
Sean, are you saying fentanyl or fentanyl? No, I want to make sure.
Shut up. All right, we're going to go into intermission. And
all right, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry to jump in and interrupt, but all successful podcasts have advertisements. This podcast wouldn't exist without EMS Connect, an online, self-paced CE platform for all levels of EMS providers and firefighters. Our site houses over 140 hours of nationally accredited content for all levels of EMS. Access to our site is only $7.50 a month. There are no join fees, cancellation fees, and definitely no bullshit. We also host monthly live sessions where you have the option to interact with our talented and engaging instructors. Just for listening, you will be automatically entered to win a $50 Amazon gift card, which will be drawn at the conclusion of each of our live sessions. All of our courses we offer can be easily imported to your NREMT profile with a few simple clicks. This greatly simplifies your recertification process. All of this can be yours for only $7.50 per month. In this economy, we're spending more than that on our daily coffees. But wait, there's more. Our site also offers EMT, advanced EMT, and paramedic level NREMT refresher courses that are 100% online and self-paced. For all of your training officers out there, we make your job super easy with our administrative tools such as uploading agency courses, skills tracking, participation reports, and so much more. To get a no-catch peek at the administrative tools and capabilities of EMS Connect, contact us at info@emsconnect.org. Again, info@emsconnect.org. All right, enough of the advertisements. Let's get back to this great episode.
Yeah, so I had never realized until that promotion that the EKG strip in EMS Connect has some weird AV block. So take a look at that. You can diagnose it.
That's what we do for you. We suppress your body's natural electrical conductivity.
Yeah, I'd say second degree block type 2 if you're taking a look at it. So appreciate everybody tuning in. That was fantastic. And when Sean talked to me earlier in the month or in the last month about the opportunity for Officer Thomas to come on, I thought it was fantastic, just because of the frontline level experience of seeing these things as they unfurl, just like you see them as an EMS specialist. And So our objectives, I thought when I put this together, I was on the front end of this. So you've actually already heard Officer Thomas, but for us, we're looking at the defining some of the toxicities and terminologies. And my part of the talk is really more of a discussion of some of the other toxidromes. So if you're looking, some of the drugs of abuse are still going to fit within what we're talking about from before, but Officer Thomas took most of those. So these are going to be some of the more generalized toxidromes and things we're going to look for. So we're going to review some of these common toxic exposures and then basic tox management for EMS and the things that you can do. And remember, with opioids, in the end, it's really more about management of the airway than it is about complete reversal. So toxicology is that field of science that helps us understand the harmful effects that chemical substances or situations can have on people, animals, and the environment. Some refer to toxicology as the science of safety. So more and more it is actually looking into some of that safety aspect of things, because it's not just abuse that we're going to see. Sometimes it's non-specific exposure. It's going to be, sorry, I don't know why my dog decided to get all fired up just right then, because nobody right now is here. But it really is more about looking at some of the potential exposures and even accidental exposures, because it's the accidental exposures that are going to give us more potential for concern. All right, so you don't have to hear me cuss my dog. So toxicity is the ability of a substance to cause harm to human physiology and tissues. The effects can strike a single cell, group of cells, organ system, or the entire body. May be visible damage or a decrease in performance or function measurable only by a test. And I think that's important to understand. You actually heard in the first part of the talk about some of these changes we see, some of the skin changes, but not everything is going to be outwardly obvious. But what we're going to talk about is some of those things that you can do, some of those things you can see that are going to pick up some of those changes that may suggest what kind of toxidrome that you're dealing with. But in the end, if I could take any drive home message, it's still the same thing we send with everything else in EMS. It's going to be more of ABCs. It's going to be the airway, breathing, circulation, stabilizing that patient. So we talk about some of the terms here: toxicant, toxin, poison. There's a lot of different things that you can see. So those are all typically used interchangeably. Remember when I talked about a few months ago about safety third? This is one of the most important things when we consider a toxidrome that we're dealing with, is that first and foremost is going to be your safety, especially if you're dealing with the potential for an exposure yourself. One thing that I talk about when I do racing related. So I just got back from Daytona about 1 a.m. this morning. It's why I've got my daughter's cup. She got me of coffee here to keep me going, because I got home at 1 a.m. and then got up at 6. So we're powering through right now. Is what I tell my motorsports team is the only thing worse than somebody getting injured is 2 people getting injured. And the only thing worse than that is when one of those people was supposed to help the first one. And so safety third is one of my least favorite things in EMS, because we need to keep our protection of ourselves and our colleagues at the forefront when it comes to treating a patient. So when we have the potential exposure, and when Sean mentioned AI-related images, the vast majority of the images I'm going to use are going to actually be AI, including the one here on the bottom right, is going to be the fact that we need to make sure that we are doing what we need to do to protect ourselves. Is it something that we could possibly have exposure to? We know opioids are a low risk, but what about something that is a biological weapon, or chemical weapons, biological weapons, infectious, whatever it may be? So even chemicals. When you're talking about a plant that may have exploded or had an issue, is there something that's being exposed that we need to, 1, detox, 2, make sure we have different types of PPE, different from our standard PPE, so more of an increased exposure risk. So making sure you take care of yourself before you get into that scene and take care of the patient. So we're going to do our first question. And since Sean apparently didn't tell Officer Thomas he's got to do questions here, so we're going to get our first question for the day.
I left him out of this, so his was just so good. I wanted yours to be interactive. His was just
fine.
So much content.
So what is going to be that most common? Oh, shoot. Let me let you do your job.
No, go ahead. No, I
Nope,
insist.
it's yours. It's yours. I
The most
insist.
common route of toxic exposure in humans, is it dermal ingested, inhalation, or intentional? So we'll launch that up and allow you all to vote on that one. Yeah, today was a little bit unique, right? In that there was just so much between two speakers and trying to balance time. We only just have a couple of poll questions here.
And I think the last 2 times you guys have had me on, I don't know if there's a message I need to get. We've had multiple presenters. So we had Dr. Milne last time that I was on too with the research.
I think that was your idea. So that
was my idea.
Yep.
That I can't keep my narrative by you being accurate.
Right. Sorry, we'll go back to it. It was my idea.
Yeah, perfect.
All right, here are those results. We got 48 say inhalation.
Oh, I love that. Yes. So think about the fact that you are sitting there. What is the most likely route that you have exposure? Dermal exposure means I have to touch it. Ingestion means I need to eat it, drink it, ingest it, whatever port that may be. Intentional, meaning intent with suicide or whatever it may be. So what is the greatest exposure is going to be, of course, inhalation, just because breathing is one of the most common things we do on a daily basis between our heart and our lungs. Those are going to be the most consistent things we do as human beings in order to continue us as human beings. So inhalation is by far going to be one of the most common. So breathing is a common symptom of life, meaning that that the inhalation exposures are going to hands down be our most common potential exposures. And that's going to be really important. When you go to a factory or an industrial area where there may be a potential exposure, maybe a train derailment, whatever it may be, you need to keep that in mind that it may not be getting touch with it that's going to get you in trouble. It may be more of an inhalation issue that may be a consideration. So that's why I mentioned some of that PPE and safety first that we need to think about as EMS. All right, acute toxicity, common substances. Gases are the number one type of exposure, environmental and otherwise. Now, some of those aren't going to cause toxicity. Right now, especially looking at some of the more in our larger cities, some of the gases that we see. In fact, one of the most common things at the Daytona 500, actually some of the races all weekend, was going to be carbon monoxide toxicity or increased levels that we have. These are environmental. They may be intentional, they may be accidental, they may be just baseline. And so we'll talk a little bit about more of that because it may change what is more of an acute versus chronic toxicity. Is it therapeutic agents, medications? Are they supposed to be taking them? And almost all medications, if we have a narrow window of therapeutics in terms of we need enough to get benefit, but too much causes toxicity. I mean, the only difference between, in many cases, between a medication and an overdose or toxicity, or even a side effect, is going to be how much of that medication we take. So therapeutic dosing and overdose, and then you're going to throw into that as well, accidental versus intentional. Did somebody take it on purpose? For me right now, one of the more common was that I had a severe headache, and so I took 8 ibuprofen. That there's a therapeutic ceiling. We've actually talked about this before with some of our pain-related conversations, that there's a therapeutic ceiling for NSAIDs, and so your max in terms of pain relief is going to be about 400 for most average adults. And then looking at something like chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is toxic on purpose. The idea behind chemotherapy for cancer is the fact that stable cells, your chronic cells, are metabolizing, reproducing at a slower rate than cancer-related cells that are disinhibited. And so chemotherapy, the purpose is poisoning those high metabolic cells and then still hurting and potentially damaging those cells, the normal cells. And that's why we end up things such as nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, hair loss that we see with a lot of the chemotherapies, because those are the most active reproducing cells within the human as an adult. Most of our cells reproduce very slowly. In children, they reproduce it's much more quickly, so there's more potential risk associated with it. But chemotherapy is pushing the toxicity of cancer cells and then allowing the normal cells to continue to survive because they have a slower metabolic rate. Drug substance abuse, we talked about that. with Officer Thomas, alcohol, drugs, whatever it may be, chemicals, whether they be household or industrial. That's actually an important conversation. When you come across somebody who has a chemical exposure, let's use bleach. Bleach, household bleach is very different than industrial bleach. Household bleach, you can basically drink it. Don't do it. You could basically drink it, and it's not going to cause anything significant in terms of toxicity and, whatever people can tolerate. Industrial bleach is very different. The concentration pH is very different. So understanding how much may be an industrial versus a household formulation of those chemicals. Biological chemical weapons, they're not very common, but there's a potential risk. You look now, there's two repositories in the United States associated with biological and chemical weapons. One is about 20 miles from me in Richmond, Kentucky. They're now decommissioning and breaking down many of those weapons, but we do the CSEP drills every single year just because of that potential exposure. If you go down to Richmond, Kentucky, as you drive, you'll see different signs that suggest how far out this will go if something goes bad. It's not a very pleasant thing to think about the signs saying what's your likelihood of exposure at this point. But just thinking about those exposure that we may see with an unstable global environment right now, what is that potential that something's going to happen? Or plants such as mushrooms, hemlock, things like that, where their toxicity, whether intentional or whether it's something like a child that just decides to go up and take something, or somebody who's walking around the woods and wants to have, a little bit of a fun time, picks a mushroom, but unfortunately picks the wrong one. Acute and chronic exposures. A lot of things have that acute and chronic potential. You think about things like, let's use acetaminophen as an example, the acute and chronic side of that. There's an acute toxicity and there's chronic exposure. NSAIDs as well. Let's talk about those just a little bit more. In terms of alcohol, the acute, we're going to see potential of intoxication, the hangovers, even birth defects, if you use it at a certain point during gestation. Chronic, it's going to cause the cirrhosis, encephalopathy, cardiovascular disease, nutritional issues. So with toxicities, it's not just the now, it's what's going on in the long term that may cause us an issue. With alcohol, we boil down to two metabolites within our body, alcohol dehydrogenase and aldehyde dehydrogenase. So the alcohol dehydrogenase processes first. So alcohol dehydrogenase, as you see there, ADH breaks down alcohol into acetaldehyde. That is the one that is actually the toxic metabolite that we see that tends to cause issues within the body. It's one of many, depending on the alcohol exposure. Then aldehyde dehydrogenase comes in behind that and breaks acetaldehyde down into acetate, which is not great, but it's more of a disposable type metabolite. Acetate is broken down into water and carbon dioxide. And so the thing is that our body tends to take these chemicals and the exposures and breaks them into things. Sometimes those things are going to be more toxic, and sometimes they're going to be less toxic. But in terms of alcohol, that's one of the things we see in terms of acute intoxication and chronic intoxication. It's actually that acetaldehyde that causes the symptoms associated with intoxication, and then some of the chronic changes that we see long term with that. Let's look at NSAIDs.
Real quick, Dr. Stanton, there's a question. Just says, can elderly develop a fentanyl reaction to fentanyl patches, perhaps with a change of metabolism?
The question is, what type of reaction are you talking about? Are we talking about a skin reaction? Or are we talking about more of the symptom of the chemical of the fentanyl itself?
There's usually a delay in those questions coming in, so let's just touch on the. I'm assuming we're talking about skin reaction. So you want to go to that, and then if he corrects me, then he said hallucinations.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, anything opioid wise, anything like that, and especially elderly, have the potential to cause more of an encephalopathy, hallucinations, symptoms like that. So there's two groups of the population that have more significant symptoms with anything. Fever is one of them. That's the elderly and the very young. They tend to have the potential of the hallucinations, the altered mental status, the confusion with any of these medications, especially when you have changes in dosing. It usually doesn't happen with long-term use with like a fentanyl patch, let's say a fentanyl patch. With the patches, you have the potential of a dermal reaction associated with the adhesive and those types of things. But with regard to the fentanyl itself, fentanyl is a relatively clean chemical, and usually, unless there's a change, they're not going to have one. But then, what are you going to throw on top of that? Is there a potential for another illness, an infection, urinary tract infection, viral infection, febrile illness, or is it somebody who has the potential of a neurocognitive decline, such as a Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, something like that, where they have the potential of actually sundowning? And you throw any type of opioid, especially an opioid, but benzodiazepine, anything like that, sleep agent, you can have a significant change in their neurocognitive status. And it can be pretty dangerous. So, for the elderly patients especially, I'm trying to avoid opioid therapeutics just because it's going to increase the potential for sundowning and altered mental status if they're prone to it to begin with, or it may uncover it like it did in my dad, where he was in the hospital and he's otherwise relatively healthy, but ends up getting a little medication. The next thing you know, he's seeing things all over the room. So it doesn't take much, especially the extremes of age, to cause some of those symptoms. So that's a great question and something we need to be careful for. If we have an elderly patient coming in that's got a hip fracture or something like that, we want to start at the lowest doses possible, because elevated doses are going to cause increased confusion, the potential respiratory compromise, and then sequela down the road that can be all kinds of different things, whether it's the fall risk, the constipation, or whatever it may be. Hopefully I answered it correctly. If not, send me another comment. Sean will jump in and I'll dive further into it. One of the others here is NSAIDs. So then one of the most common medications that we deal with, especially with arthritis, osteoarthritis, acute overdose in terms of taking too much of it, GI symptoms, CNS symptoms, acid-base disturbance, renal issues that we may see. But right now, interestingly, the question I had earlier there with regard to the changes they see that Officer Thomas sees on the streets with regard to the changes in the opioids means, but in our healthcare side of it means we're seeing increased use of NSAIDs. NSAIDs are awesome acutely, and then appropriate ones in a longer fashion. But we need to consider that because now our renal doctors are seeing much more in terms of chronic kidney disease, GI hemorrhage, cerebral vascular disease, because of more people being on chronic long-term NSAIDs. And so keep in mind that even common medications such as Uraleve, which is, in the naproxen sodiums, the ibuprofens, things like that, on the acute and chronic stage, the over-the-counter medicines can potentially be just as dangerous. I mean, the Imodium is one that became really big over the last couple of years just because of decreased access to some of the opioids, because of the borderline partial opioid effects we see with Imodium AD in very high doses. All right, so a toxidrome is a collection of symptoms caused by a toxic chemical or drug. The term is a combination of the words toxic and syndrome. So looking at the things that the common manifestations, and that's what I want you to take home from our conversation this evening, is recognizing some of these patterns. And Officer Thomas actually mentioned a couple of them. The challenge is with most things, the most common pharmacy is polypharmacy, meaning that with overdoses or whatever it may be, it's often not a singular thing that's involved. Often if it's opioids, there's going to be some benzos involved. Is there a plus minus an amphetamine involved? Interestingly, the fentanyl is being, well, now some of the others, but fentanyl, let's just use fentanyl as the example, is being added to a lot of drugs because it increases the addiction potential. So you have methamphetamines, you have whatever ketamine, whatever the drug is, but they're adding fentanyl to it in order to increase the addiction potential, because the opioid addiction is much stronger and earlier onset than a lot of the others. And so they'll add that to it in order to get people back to the other drug that they think they're looking for. And so it's to increase some of that addiction potential out there. So you may see that co-ingestion, that polypharmacy. Some of the common toxidromes we're going to see are going to be our anticholinergics caused by things like antihistamines. That's a super common one. People think they have bad allergies, so they take a ton of Benadryl or diphenhydramine, and next thing you know, they can't pee. There's a bunch of other stuff we'll talk about here in a minute. Some of the antipsychotics, the atropine, when you're giving a bunch of atropine, which is interesting because now you're going to use that as a treatment for some of the cholinergic toxicities, and then some of the natural exposures such as gemcitabine. We talk about opioids caused by fentanyl, heroin, other opioid analogs, whether it is natural, which would make an opiate. An opiate is a natural transition from the opium poppy plant, and an opioid, which can include the natural and the synthetic versions of that. A sympathomimetic, you look at cocaines, amphetamines, bath salts, ecstasy, and some of these. Some are sedative hypnotics, which is alcohol and benzodiazepines. And then our cholinergics caused by organophosphates, which is, and most people say fertilizer, but it's not really the fertilizer, it's the pesticides and organic phosphates that cause the cholinergic toxicity, physostigmine, and then even some of the nerve gases are associated with cholinergic. So these are actually the 5 most common toxidromes that you're going to potentially see. And we're going to talk about some of the recognition symptoms and things that you can do. But this is, if I could give you one thing to remember in this discussion, it's these 5 topics, because I want you to be able to, as an EMS professional, you have to remember everything healthcare. It's like an emergency physician. It's what's your specialty? I'm the specialty of everything. You're the specialty of everything. And so how can we put these into more reasonable buckets of symptoms and treatment to where I don't have to remember every single thing that I'm dealing with, but may need to remember those buckets so I know what to look for. I don't know if you can tell that that's an AI image, but yes, it's an AI image. It actually is one of the toxidromes that we're going to talk about here shortly. So as key is knowing the patterns. We can learn the individual substance, but it's better to know the family or the patterns that you're going to deal with. Medicine is all about pattern recognition. The more experience you have, the more patterns you recognize, the easier it is to identify, even if you're not actively thinking about that diagnosis. It's about being able to recognize it in your brain saying, wait a second, I know this one. This is one I've seen before. And the more experience you have, the easier that comes by as you move forward. So knowing that pattern. So here's the most common. So these are the things that we can assess as EMS professionals. The heart rate and blood pressure, our respiration rate. What's the temp doing? What are our eyes doing? The eyes tell the story. Bowel sounds. What's going on there, whether it's just bowel sounds or whether it's more some of the GI symptoms. And what's going on? Are they sweating? Not sweating? And we can actually break up these 5 common toxidromes just by these symptoms right here. So you have 6 sets of symptoms or evaluation symptoms. And I'll boil down some of these more specific here in a second. We'll go by one as we go through it. All right, so we're going to do question number 2. Sean, you do your thing.
Yeah, I want to mention the quick fact sheet has this exact diagram on it, as you were saying, because this is, we didn't even communicate this, but this is the huge takeaway of this, at least the second half of the lecture, right? And then I will tell you, as the person who creates the quiz, there are a majority of the questions are going to have you basically put whatever, give you a list of signs and symptoms, and you're going to put it into one of these 5 categories. So this is a great reminder and a good tool to use for that written exam.
And that's a great transition, because I would recommend that is a great graph to make small and laminate it and put it with your badge or whatever it may be, because it is a really nice reference. And that's not one that I put together. It's one that has been floating around since I was a medical student 20 something years ago. So if you want to take that, shrink it down, laminate it, have it in your bus, whatever you need to do. It's a great reference point, because it sometimes gets a little bit confusing in terms of what is what, unless you have another tip. And that may be just as easy to look at that little cheat sheet.
Yeah, solid work. So here's our question. A farm worker is found with salivation, sweating, lacrimation, gastric defecation, gastric cramping, and emesis. Pupils are also small, meiosis. What could this suggest? A, opioid toxidrome like heroin, the cholerogenic toxidrome, which is organophosphate, anti-cholerogenic toxidrome, antihistamines, or symptopathogenic toxidrome. You're just trying to screw with me here. Cocaine. So launch that up there. the quick poll only allows a certain number of characters. So yes, you see the question a little bit different on the screen itself, but you should be able to get the right answer with this one.
Yeah, I hadn't even noticed the gastric and the gastric cramping. It was supposed to be gastric symptoms.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the sympathomimetic. Yeah, that's a difficult one for sure.
I can't. I don't know. I'm just trying to say it here. I'm gonna mute the microphone and just sit here and practice it.
Just try. Yes, you should. Yeah. Looking at some of these things, interestingly, this very diagnosis, back about 12 years ago, I had buses every day for about 2 weeks. Well, not buses, like the passenger van, the 15 passenger van coming into the emergency department, dropping off about 10 to 12 workers because it was very hot, very humid. And these folks were getting ill associated with it. It was not specifically this one, but it's very similar in terms of what they were getting when they were getting exposed in the fields.
Interesting. Well, you got 100%, well, 100%, sorry, 86% close to go with the cholerogenic toxidrome organophosphate.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. I did get eventually 100% if we consider all four of them. But it's one of those things that is absolutely right. It's a cholinergic toxidrome associated with organophosphates. If you look at this, kind of look right there, the salivating is sweating, S. Lacrimation is going to be L. Now we're going to end up with some of our sludge M type things as we work our way through this. So looking at some of those key things that we look for with an organic phosphate or cholinergic toxidrome. All right. First and foremost, we're going to talk about some of these specifics as we move through some of these toxidromes that we deal with. But the intervention, safety is not third. Make sure that you have your proper PPE, that you're protected, and then we're going to decon the patient if necessary. Not only for yourself, the EM staff, whatever it may be. As I mentioned, the only thing worse than one is two. The only thing worse than two is the one that was supposed to help the other one. So making sure we do whatever we need to do to make sure that we are safe and that we have decreased the risk of further exposure. Because in the case of an organophosphate, if it's chemicals, pesticides that are getting from the plants that they're harvesting, they're going to have continued dermal exposure if we don't decontamination. That includes clothes. That includes washing them off. And then there's some other specifics that may be there, and we'll talk about how to get some of those ideas for some of the specifics. As always, ABC, airway, breathing, circulation, as I taught ATLS early this morning. That order is based on whatever's going to kill them first. So address the ABCs in the order that is most pertinent to that patient at the moment. The toxidrome, specific considerations that we'll talk about. Then, of course, the disposition. Where do they need to go if we have a concern? So let's talk about anticholinergics. We talk about the ABCs. This is what we're going to do. We're going to do what we need to do to make sure that we're safe. Safety not third, decon, ABCs. Some of the symptoms for the anticholinergic in terms of managing is going to be a physostigmine with caution. I've never used it. It is something that's out there. Our EMS agencies aren't going to cover it. So the BLS teaching is the exact same as the ALS, the treatment. It's going to be the idea of physostigmine, but for the vast majority of these, it's going to be supportive care. Interestingly, for histamines, for antihistamines, the most common symptom and the reason you may get called, other than being sleepy, is the fact they can't pee. It's one of those things that it's one of the characteristics of this. So somebody tries to overdose on diphenhydramine. For the vast majority of them, it's not going to get them very far other than getting sleepy, but they're not going to be able to pee, and that can be quite uncomfortable for them. So that is one of the manifestation is going to be that can't urinate type of patient.
Well, I know we've seen a couple in the younger populations of taking large doses of this for the sleepy euphoric feeling. So that might be maybe not on the suicide intentional side, but I know I've had one for sure, if not maybe two younger students who are taking a lot of this in an attempt to get high. I guess I don't really understand that, but
yeah, that's definitely going to be a young thing because being 48 years old, the one thing that I hate about being sleepy and getting sleep is having to urinate. So and not being able to. So it's one of those things that maybe that's a young person thing where you have a large bladder and a well functional urinary sphincter. Sure, whatever. But that's one thing to keep in mind, and that's one thing I tell folks when they come in before their behavioral health is that their biggest concern and challenge is going to be actually initiating micturition. That's a big word for the day. Intervention to cholinergics. Again, ABC safety not third, still number one. Atropine. This is the one for atropine for the muscarinic effects. Prehospital or 2-PAM for some of the nicotine effects. We're going to see this with some of the green tobacco sickness. We're going to see this with some of the organophosphates, or the ones that I actually saw were green tobacco sickness. And when it's hot and it's humid and the workers are sweaty and the tobacco is green, that's the highest exposure to the nicotine. So it's basically a nicotine toxicity with green tobacco sickness. It's one if you have farming communities that you're going to potentially see, especially if the weather is hot and humid. As I mentioned, I'd never seen and have not seen since what I saw that year for about 2 weeks. Every day, the 15-passenger van would pull up, drop off about 10 to 15 workers, and then it would speed on. And we got to the point that we actually had to sedate and intubate one of them. But most of them, it was just watching and waiting for the green tobacco sickness. And you could always tell it because their shoes and their pants were stained green from the tobacco itself as they cut it. As they cut it at the base, it would actually contaminate their clothing. Atropine, this is one of those things that it says how much atropine, the amount of atropine that's necessary to stop the symptoms. You just keep going. You don't say just 1 milligram and you're done. It is as much as atropine is necessary to fix the problem that you're dealing with. And then the prehospital 2-PAM for the nicotinic. I've actually used that a couple of times. That's something that's going to tend to be more in the EM setting. If you have somebody that you're very confident that's a cholinergic, if you're ALS, that atropine, which is on board for us in the in your most ALS units, we're going to have, I guess all of them are going to have some form of atropine on board that you can provide these patients. So if you pick up somebody from the field that has just been sprayed, or they're picking tobacco, actually it wouldn't be the tobacco at this point, it'd just be the spraying, then the atropine is the way to go. These are the folks that are going to be drooling all over themselves. They're just going to look like a puppy dog. They're just going to be sweaty, just hot. They're just going to look like they are just completely worn out. Again, referring to your little form there. Interventions, opioids. Same thing, top, Narcan or naloxone. That is the initial intervention. For me, it's can I prevent an advanced airway with naloxone? If not, if we're to the point that somebody has respiratory arrest or a code, it's about controlling the airway. If I've secured the airway, bag valve mask, intubation, whatever it may be, then the Narcan is secondary. Because the idea behind Narcan is I wake somebody up to where they don't need an intervention. Even though the research now shows that Narcan it's kind of getting there, that it shows that it may increase survival associated with opioid overdoses. I think that's more just because of the not having to potentially do an advanced airway. But if you manage the airway, you've got everything done that you need to do. The cause of death with opioid overdoses is going to be respiratory arrest and respiratory suppression. If you manage that part, then it's at that point just waiting it out. You can do Narcan, but what I find is the complication that we talk about is giving people Narcan to the point that they are maintaining their own airway, but not to the point that now it increases our risk because they sign out or refuse to go to the hospital because we've now initiated opioid withdrawal. So there's a lot there, and I think that's going to change quite a bit as we move forward with the potential for induction of recovery at the scene by EMS. I think a lot of us now are looking at possible protocols associated with buprenorphine or induction in the field. So I think there's a lot of this that's going to change. Is there anything that's going to be harmed by giving Narcan? No, but especially with cardiac arrest and resuscitation, I don't want it to get in the way of what's going to help them, which is management of the airway and high quality CPR if it is a cardiac arrest. But it is available there as well. The sympathomimetics, I got some of that right now. Got my coffee. That's going to be one of my sympathomimetics. Cocaine is going to fall under there as well. Our initial evaluation is still the exact same as it was before. For this one, it is mainly supportive care. If they're to the point that they have hyperthermia associated with it, then cooling measures for that. And then one of the most important things is going to be that sedation that we have for agitation, because one of the very few emergencies associated with this is actually going to be with the agitation. Now, mentioned earlier is by Officer Thomas was excited delirium, and that is police still use that on occasion. I'm not sure why my computer is now trying to download my phone, but it's excited delirium. All right, that's no longer the term that's used. It had to do, there's a lot of things that rolled into that, but it was used negatively against EMS and police because it was felt to be a discriminatory term. The term now is going to be hyperactive delirium with agitation. So keep in mind that that's going to be important in terms of your terminology and protection as you move forward, because the treatment for the agitation is often going to be ketamine. There's other agents that are out there as well, but ketamine is still the substance of choice. Some have gone against it just because of some of the lawsuits that have been out there, but it's still the best medication for addressing hyperactive delirium with agitation. And that is, hyperactive delirium with agitation is a medical emergency. It is something that if we don't address, the patient will die. And the reason we see patients passing away is often that it's given too late and they're already past that precipice of decompensation. So they're cruising, hyperagitated state, they're fired up, and then they crash, and the body just can't maintain after that. And, if there's a message I can take, soapbox message, is that once we're giving medications, the patient is no longer a law enforcement patient. They can assist us in terms of securing the patient, but the patient now then at that point is a medical patient. They need to be monitored, secured, and positioned as a medical patient as we move forward and to our eventual disposition location. Sedatives and hypnotics. He mentioned some of the the Xanax bars. There's a whole different thing with regard to conversation as he talked about with the polypharmacy associated with the fake ones, with the street versions of these that have a lot of polypharmacy and may have the Xanax in it. It may also have some fentanyl, may have some xylazine, may have all different types of things. Again, same thing. Decon, if necessary, safety, making sure PPE, ABCs. It's going to be supportive care, including airway management. Our biggest risk, again, is going to be the airway compromise, hypoxemia, and may even be some of the needing the vasopressors or fluids because of hypotension, of the lack of vascular tone. Some of the medications you can use if you're carrying as an ALS service, if you're carrying some of the vasopressors, you can use those. But honestly, giving some fluids up front, seeing how they respond, and then seeing if you need something to help squeeze the vessel a little bit more. Now, here's one of the most important things for me is we have support out there. One of my good friends and where I got a lot of these topics from is a Tox fellow out of Colorado. And he was telling me that one of the most important things that you can do is call for help. The Poison Control Centers, 1-800-222-1222. That's nationwide. Giving them a call and asking them. Now, if it's a true, just singular exposure to a medication, toxin, you may be able to get it, mail it, whatever it may be. But if it's, say, it's just a chemical that's out there, a household cleaning agent, giving them a call, they are pretty impressive at being able to say, this is what it is, this is what to expect, and this is what the intervention is going to be as you move forward. We are going to call them. Even if I know what the treatment's going to be for these toxicities, I'm going to call them because I want to make sure that I have the most up-to-date management in place. Used to about 10 years ago, almost every toxicity overdose is going to get activated charcoal. Now we realize there's very few of these patients that need activated charcoal. Is it a supportive management thing, an observation side, or is there a medication intervention that we need to give to these patients as they present to it? So don't be afraid to give that. I love this to be available to everybody. Just getting that number, putting it in your phone, in your device, having it in the unit, whatever it may be, giving them a call and asking their input. They'll ask your name, they'll ask the patient's name, and they will actually follow up. If you tell them which hospital you're going to, they will follow up with the patient later. They'll say, we already know about this. We already have a case on this. Here's what we're recommending. Continue to do this. Often it is just a monitoring and observation type thing for the vast majority of things we see, but there may be something else that's involved as well, especially if it's a chemical or a substance that has multiple chemicals on it or something you don't recognize. So when you go to a scene where a possible ingestion, if you can get a label, if you can get the bottle, take that with you, take a picture of it, do whatever you can in order for us to, because that changes everything. We'll just use that bleach. I talked about bleach earlier. With bleach, is it industrial or is it household? If it's household, I'm pretty much done. I'm not going to be really worried about anything. If it's a bleach from a factory, that's very different. You look at something like a gasoline ingestion. Hydrocarbons, as ingested, are not going to be dangerous. Where they become dangerous is where back in the day, when you would give them Epicac, or they just get sick on their own, they'd vomit. It's aspirated as an aspiration. It's very dangerous. And so, looking at some of those key details and things that I don't expect you to remember, it is being willing to call them and talk to poison control about this. MSDS, if it's a factory, business, whatever it may be, or if it's just a bottle, there should be an MSDS. If it's an actual company, they should have those on site. Most of us in EMS and fire are going to have some of those poison books that you can reference as well. Again, if you have any questions, just call poison control. They can get you through there pretty quickly. All right. As that, I think I caught us up because Sean mentioned to me and mentioned right there at the middle that I was going to stumble into the next hour, and I wanted to prove him wrong. So, Sean, take that. And actually, if you got any questions, this gives us time for that.
That's it. I hate to cut you off, but this was just a sample of one of our live sessions from one of our amazing educators. If you'd like to join our monthly sessions for free, you can follow us on Facebook by searching emsconnect.org and register for our next session. We give away an Amazon $50 gift card, and you're able to interact with our speakers in real time. If you'd like to get CE credit for attending these live lectures, then you need to become a member over at www.emsconnect.org. Our membership is only $7.50 per month, and you get access to our live sessions as well as our archive that houses over 140 hours of content by our amazing speakers. Also, you can purchase our NREMT 100% online EMT, advanced EMT, and paramedic refresher courses, again at www.emsconnect.org. Sign up today and get educated. Hey, thanks for checking out another episode of EMS Connect on Shift. Please subscribe, review, and rate our podcast on your favorite platforms. Those ratings really help our podcast grow and reach new listeners. Also, make sure to like and follow our social media sites by searching EMS Connect on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks for getting educated with EMS Connect.